Welcome to the story of a mathematician whose life was as tragic as his mind was brilliant. We are looking at the life of Niels Henrik Abel, exploring a chronological journey through the 26 years that completely redefined mathematics. Though he lived in crushing poverty, his mathematical legacy is so vast that the great mathematician Charles Hermite once declared Abel had left enough material to keep mathematicians busy for 500 years. To understand Abel's genius, we first have to understand the unsolvable problem of his era. For 300 years, the greatest minds in mathematics, giants like Newton, Euler, and Lagrange, had searched for a general algebraic solution to equations of the fifth degree, known as the quintic. The mathematical world assumed a solution existed and just hadn't been found yet, but they were wrong. At barely 22 years old, Abel did the unthinkable and proved mathematically that a general solution to the quintic equation by radicals is entirely impossible. Abel's ascent is even more miraculous when you look at where he started. Born in 1802, he grew up in a Norway devastated by the Napoleonic Wars, where a British naval blockade had caused a catastrophic economic crisis and widespread famine. He was born into an intellectual vacuum with no great universities and no early mentors. To make matters worse, his father, though a prominent minister and politician, was an alcoholic who ultimately drank himself to death, leaving the family destitute. The turning point in Abel's life arrived in 1817 with a new mathematics teacher named Bernd Holmboe. Holmboe was hired by the cathedral school to replace a brutal teacher who was dismissed after flogging a student so severely that the boy died. Holmboe immediately recognized Abel's transcendent genius, noting his insatiable interest in the subject. Instead of forcing Abel to stick to standard textbooks, Holmboe guided him to read the original masterpieces of Euler, Newton, and Lagrange. When asked later how he managed to forge ahead so rapidly, Abel gave a piece of advice that is still legendary today. He learned by studying the masters, not their pupils. In 1821, Abel actually thought he had solved the famous quintic problem and submitted his work to the Danish mathematician Ferdinand Degen. When Degen requested a numerical example, Abel quickly realized his own error. But Degen gave him a piece of advice that changed history. He pointed Abel toward the study of elliptic integrals, predicting it would be a Strait of Magellan, leading into a tremendous analytic ocean. By 1824, Abel had perfected his impossibility proof for the quintic equation. Desperate to win a travel grant to meet the masters of Europe, he paid to print the proof himself, heavily compressing it to just 6 pages to save on printing costs. He sent this dense masterpiece to the undisputed prince of mathematics, Carl Friedrich Gauss. In a heartbreaking historical twist, Gauss assumed it was crank mathematics, threw it aside as a monstrosity, and never even opened the letter. Discouraged and intimidated by Gauss's reputation, Abel detoured to Berlin in 1825. This was a lucky break, as he met August Krell, an engineer who instantly recognized Abel's monumental talent. Krell was about to launch the very first German mathematical journal, and Abel became his star contributor. In the first volumes alone, Abel contributed numerous memoirs that propelled both his own fame and the success of Krell's journal. In 1826, Abel produced his greatest insight. The old guard, like Legendre, had spent 40 years hitting a wall while studying elliptic integrals. Abel used a brilliant conceptual tool, mathematical inversion. By treating the inverses of these integrals as functions themselves, he discovered double periodicity, functions that repeat in a grid of periods rather than a single loop. As Abel himself noted, he had proved something that seemed impossible. But Paris, the mathematical capital of the world, was a disaster for him. At 24 years old, Abel was unknown, physically failing and starving, able to afford only 1 meal a day. He submitted his crowning masterpiece to the Institut de France, but Augustin-Louis Cauchy, the leading French mathematician, scarcely deigned to glance at it and lost the manuscript in his messy files. This lost Paris memoir contained Abel's theorem, a sweeping generalization that essentially founded the theory of algebraic functions. The paper introduced the fundamental quantity of the genus, the number of holes in a surface, a concept decades ahead of its time. Because it went unread by Cauchy, this monumental work vanished until Cauchy found it in 1830, after which it was lost again and only finally uncovered in Florence in 1952. Abel returned to Norway in May 1827, exhausted, deep in debt, and suffering from the tuberculosis that would eventually end his life. Adding insult to injury, the university professorship he desperately needed was awarded to his old teacher, Holmboe. Abel was forced to survive on substitute teaching and private tutoring while carrying the heavy burden of providing for his impoverished family. Despite dying and being utterly destitute, Abel entered a fierce but brilliant rivalry with Carl Jacobi, a well-funded German mathematician. When Jacobi published on elliptic transformations, Abel wrote furiously to prove that Jacobi's discoveries were actually consequences of his own earlier work. Jacobi graciously admitted Abel's priority, and the legendary Legendre declared that these works placed both men as the foremost analysts of their time. By Christmas 1828, Abel traveled by sled to visit his fiancée in Froland, Norway, where he became bedridden with severe tuberculosis. Terrified that his lost Paris memoir would never be found, he reconstructed its main theorem from pure memory. He wrote it out on 2 brief pages, containing no introduction and no superfluous remarks, a brilliant monument resplendent in its simple lines. The ending of Abel's life is one of the most painful ironies in the history of science. After enduring terrible agony, Niels Henrik Abel died on April 6, 1829, at the age of just 26. Exactly 2 days later, a letter arrived from Krell announcing that the University of Berlin had finally granted Abel a secure chair of mathematics. In 1830, the Paris Academy posthumously awarded him the prestigious Grand Prix. Today, Abel's name is cemented in the bedrock of mathematics, immortalized in terms like Abelian Groups, Abelian Integrals, and Abelian Functions. Though his life was brief and plagued by poverty and illness, his creative genius changed the world. As Hermite perfectly summarized, Abel left mathematicians enough brilliant ideas to keep them busy for 500 years.